Chapter 1, Probable Cause. The following account is of a crime that was perpetrated in a video store where my husband Frank worked. I am going to give you a little background here. Back in January of 1996, Frank was drowning in credit card debt. He had been getting one credit card to pay another. This was going on for about 8 years. I asked Frank on several occasions, "How is our financial situation?" And he said, "Marie, don't worry. We are doing great. And we are breaking even with the bills, and we have plenty of available credit." I didn't have a clue of what was going to happen next. Then, in September of 1996, the United States Postal Service broke into our home with guns drawn and seized evidence which was used to railroad Frank to prison for credit card fraud and mail fraud. He was sentenced to 12 to 14 months. Before he self-surrendered, he hired people to cover for him while he was paying his debt to society. He hired this guy that he knew for a while and was a steady customer in the video store, and his friend. Since this guy's name was Johnson, I will use it here for this story because it is a common name. Frank confided in him and let Mr. Johnson know about his pending incarceration. You guessed it, Mr. Johnson went from being Frank's huckleberry friend to becoming the electronic criminal, is what this story is all about. After Mr. Johnson perpetrated his crime at the video store, Frank was serving his time at the prison camp. Some of the information used in this expose was compiled by Frank while he was at the prison camp to clear his name of any wrongdoing against the video store and making sure that Mr. Johnson doesn't get away scot-free, leaving the video store holding the bag. All the funds that Mr. Johnson stole from the video store was going to have to be paid back by this small business, or it will have to close down. This is what went down. Frank was researching his case and Mr. Johnson's scheme at the law library to provide the video store with information to give the banks involved, to convict Mr. Johnson, and to get the video store off the hook. Next, Frank kept sending me reports of this ongoing investigation of Mr. Johnson and his scheme. I kept giving these reports to the owner of the video store as fast as Frank sent them to me. I was keeping copies of these reports in a box with all our papers pertinent to Frank's case. Since this story happened over 20 years ago, I am going to interpret what happened using the reports that Frank sent me to tell the story of how Mr. Johnson became an electronic criminal. The following count is of a crime that was perpetrated in a video store by Frank's huckleberry friend, using the store's point-of-sale terminal. This friend of Frank name was Mr. Johnson, and he embezzled thousands of dollars over several months in 1997. 3 banks were involved in this swindle. The amount that Mr. Johnson ended up getting was $46,000. The scheme was discovered by my husband Frank. The following ongoing investigation should prove probable cause. I believe that 3 laws were broken in the commission of this embezzlement of funds from the video store by Mr. Johnson. They are as follows. Law 1, wire fraud, because the video store's access device was connected to the telephone line. Law 2, credit card fraud, because Mr. Johnson used credit cards to perpetrate his crime. And Law 3, conspiracy, because at least one other person was involved. There could be other charges, but I think that's enough for now. Mr. Johnson used the video store's access device to embezzle money for his own personal use. He achieved this by transferring money from someone else's credit card to his Mac Visa account. Mr. Johnson was doing this for months. The video store was not aware of his scheme. Remember, what I'm discussing happened before Frank went to the prison camp. This fraudulent activity was going on undetected by this small business. Frank confided in Mr. Johnson because he promised to help me while Frank was away, and to cover his shifts and drive him to the prison camp to self-surrender. Frank didn't have a clue to what Mr. Johnson was doing, and when he finally took all the money that he intended to take, he told Frank that he took $46,000, which was in various denominations, and that he used the store's access device to do this. Frank couldn't believe what he told him. When Frank went home, he started thinking, what's going to happen while I'm in prison? If this guy is going to use me as a scapegoat. Frank was in enough trouble and owed enough money on his own and didn't need to be framed by Mr. Johnson, who was scheduled to open the video store the next day. Frank wasn't due until 2 p.m. When Frank arrived, he made sure that he had a blank videotape in the camcorder, just in case Mr. Johnson said or did anything before Mr. Johnson was ready to leave. Frank asked him, did you really get $46,000 from the store's access device? Frank then backed up, luring Mr. Johnson closer to the camcorder, and this is what he told Frank. I got 46 G's. And then in a bragging fashion, he said $46,000. Then he explained how he did it. Mr. Johnson told Frank that he took different amounts, which made up the $46,000. Frank asked him, why didn't you get more? Mr. Johnson told Frank that he didn't want to get in too deep in case he got caught. He also explained how he withdrew $10,000 in cash at one time, and if he would have taken more, the bank would have had to fill out a report. Mr. Johnson left the video store. Boy, was Frank glad that he had the camcorder on record. Frank couldn't wait to view the videotape. It came out very clear, and Frank was relieved. In case Mr. Johnson tried to involve Frank, he had his confession on tape. The next day, which was Sunday, Frank opened the store, and Mr. Johnson came in at 2 p.m. He showed Frank a 4-page bank statement showing all the transactions that he made. Mr. Johnson didn't say a word the rest of the shift. Frank and Mr. Johnson closed the store and left together. Mr. Johnson left the 4-page bank statement in the video store. Frank retrieved this 4-page bank statement and brought it home and put it in the box with all the other papers pertinent to Frank's case. Frank told his boss about the videotape confession of Mr. Johnson and the 4-page bank statement. She told Frank that the merchant bank contacted her about the large transactions, and they were all made on Frank's days off. The merchant bank also told his boss that the video store was going to have to pay the money back unless they could prove that Mr. Johnson was the perpetrator. Frank called his lawyer and told him about the situation at the video store. He told Frank that as long as he has that videotape confession, he's protected from Mr. Johnson from trying to involve him later.